I feel like each of the last one of these videos always came with this little misnomer at the beginning being like, crazy time for me, just came off of this, and this. Now we're in between rounds and got to do this. So is it, should I just keep saying that? Because quite legitimately, and at least one of you know this very well, because I just left your house a little bit ago, just flew back in North America. The rounds just ended. I am recording this literally, this time I actually thread that needle. I am recording this after this, the second round is now over. The conference finals has not yet begun, but tonight they will. And this is a little bit later in the day, and I'm a little bit fuzzy from the flight. So I'm telling you firsthand, this is coming out at least a game into the next round. But I'm trying my best, folks. And as you can tell by the lack of shaving, I prioritize the video over my own grooming. So hopefully that doesn't mean a rambly one. But hey, you know what? Enough of the intro. Let's get going. I will do what I did last time around. I'm going to start with kind of the teams that did not make it this far, and then I'm going to do a little preview into the next round. So here we go. The problem with starting something that seems like a good idea and then trying to follow it means you've got to follow the template. So what I really like that I did is I kind of ranked the teams that got knocked out of the last round, just kind of going over in terms of the ones that I think are in the best situation to the worst. And the reason why I say that that's a really tough challenge and a tough ask is I think the fourth team is very clear, but I honestly think the top three, it's 1A, 1B, 1C, and I think it depends on the day you catch me that I would rank them in different orders. So I'm going to go with an order, but I know already whichever team I'm going to put third, there's an easy argument to say they should be first, but hey, they're my rankings. I can do what I want. So perhaps surprisingly, and this maybe is surprisingly to me, because if I would have started this, or if I would have planned this before this, the last few games panned out, I would have put the Knicks probably third, and yet I'm putting them first. And I know it's a bit controversial because they're definitely banged up. I think they have probably of the three teams I'm going to mention, probably the worst of the three, but that's not saying that they're bad, obviously. But the other two I think are actually quite good and top class of the league. I'm putting this because, I mean, the Knicks just went through a playoff run, but definitely a series where if they're not hurt, I don't think we're having this conversation. And I think it came down to a lot of bad luck. Now, that does not guarantee them anything from next year. But what that does is essentially, aside from maybe talking to their coach about playing time, I think they're in the best standing because they're in the East. And because I don't think they stand to lose that much, nor do they have to tinker that much. I think like anything else, you can always use depth, and I'll get onto that much later. But I mean, you've got a phenomenal crowd in Madison Square Garden, so anytime you make a playoff run like this, like say into next year, you've got that locked down. I think Brunson made that kind of step this year. Does he continue it next year? But he's definitely now being talked about with all those 40-plus games as someone who's going to get a lot of preseason hype. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and say he was a pickup in our league this year. He won't be next year. Someone is definitely going to be taking him. I think you look at the things that translate, like their harder defense and with the rules that the refs are calling, assuming that that's going to carry on to next year, I think they translate quite well. And then the big thing that really made me do this, so maybe I'm overhyping this, but after a flight and a little bit of consideration, I actually think that if they were even healthy, not even completely healthy, Randall doesn't have to come back. In fact, there's the argument to be made that Ewing theory there, that maybe they're a bit better with Randall off the floor. If we're having a conversation about them with Brunson healthy, OG healthy, Hart healthy, fill in the gap, if they're back to their 7 or 8 rotation, I think they beat the Celtics this year, to be honest with you, because I think the Celtics are a more talented team, but they don't always play like it, which I'll get to later. So for me, right now, the team that I think needs the less tinkering and is looking positively for next year, I guess it's the Knicks. I don't expect any of these three to be without controversy, and sorry that I'm going to keep saying it, but I just feel like I have to. But I would put number 2 Denver, and even though they didn't finish first in the West, I think being the defending champions, and I know they just got gut punched in a Game 7, it looked ridiculous, and you know, I probably won't talk about it as much when I get to Minnesota, so now's as good a time of any. There was a really interesting series where the series was good, but none of the games were really. I mean, Game 7 was definitely the best game, but when one team was on and could figure out the other team, they just got shellacked, right? And so there was no actual like great basketball. It was one team excelling and the other one feeling like they were hopeful or hopeless and nothing they could do could possibly jump out of it. And that went from, you know, Minnesota looking like they were going to run it with like an amazing game 2 where they looked near perfect, to Jokic doing whatever he wanted and essentially making the defensive player of the year look useless, to the point that he kept getting these comments by people like Barkley, Draymond Green, who I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. And yet, down whatever the peak was, they were down the 20 to 30 point kind of gap at one point in game 7. They came back and it didn't feel weird that they did. But I think looking at Denver, I think their biggest problem that I would probably want to address, and the reason I didn't have them number 1, but the reason why they got to consider this, let's be honest, they're going to return the bulk of their roster, and the bulk of the roster is fantastic because the people that they need the most are their 1-2 punch. I think Gordon showed that he's just not the person they can depend on, though. And when he's on, they're essentially unbeatable, because the tandem of Murray and Jokic, you kind of forget, like, their little, it's not a traditional pick and roll, but that pick and pop, that high post and then cutting down, it's essentially unstoppable. The problem is when it is stoppable, or when one of them needs a break or both of them need a break, that's what Denver needs to address. They don't have anything else. And like I said, when Gordon's on or Porter's on, they get by. Christian Brown has shown some diversity, but he's got a ceiling that's not that high. They don't necessarily need like that third, head of an elite class all NBA, but they need something that makes them look different. And I think I'm going to refer to this a little bit later on when I get to my 2 cents, because I think some possibilities are there. But I think the biggest thing that Denver needs is just someone to come in and bring something else, a different look. It doesn't even have to be a sustainable look, a look that they can just use for a little bit. And whether that's one person using their offense or a different kind of size structure matchup, they just need something different, because you could tell when Minnesota figured them out, they didn't have a second trick, because their first trick is so good. They never feel like they really need another one, because obviously with their first trick having multiple heads and Jokic being able to kind of bring out the best of everyone on the court, you don't think you need another look. But if you look at when they were riding low, I mean, if they would have scored anything in the third quarter of that game 7, they would have won, right? I mean, if you look, it was just, they had an anemic offense. They couldn't do anything. They were getting open looks, to be honest. It's a lot to put on 1 or 2 people that if they're on, they're on, and if they're off, they're screwed. But again, we're talking about the nitpicky of probably the 2 best teams in the league, right? So they don't need to blow it up. They just need a little bit of a tweak. So that's why I have them at number 2. Again, the problem with this method is a team had to go third that didn't deserve to be third in this ranking. And in this case, you've got the team who was number 1 in the West after the regular season and arguably has the best assets of any of these teams. So you would think looking forward, I'd have them at my number 1. And again, I thought about that. And at one point in this iteration, I had that. And I will go through a little bit of my train of thought later when we get to another little segment. But realistically, what it came down to is, in 5 years, which team do I think is best? Obviously, it's going to be them, because they've got such a young, talented group, such a good core nucleus that I think projections into the future, that's the team I'd go with. But I was going for next year, right? And I think for next year, I think some of in your first run, you're never supposed to really go that far. And Chet Holmgren gave a very interesting answer, saying if he plays another 12 years, the likelihood of him winning 12 championships in a row is unlikely. But he didn't say impossible. He just said, so it's likely that at some point I might have to face, losing a playoff match again. But I want to remember this feeling. So good answer, but shows a little bit in terms of his expectations that he honestly said that it's not like a given that I'll have to lose in the next 12 years either. I do think they have a lot of people in the right spots. I think they just made the wrong move in Hayward at the trade deadline. He's just, look at a fan base when a guy leaves and how disappointed they are. And he's left enough teams and no one really cries. Apparently he's a nice guy, but the fan base isn't like, why did you lose Hayward? It's always like, yeah, okay, moved on. That kind of tell you something. But I think the possibility here for the Pelicans is endless because of their draft picks and because of the nucleus they have. But it just became clear that there's a few holes they need addressed. And I don't think that they need to go drastic because their nucleus is good. But I do think they have to be a bit more creative than maybe my top 2, which is why I put them third. And like I keep teasing to the end, they pop up later when I start going through a little bit of my 2 cents. So we'll get to that part later on. The fourth of 4 was going to be clear from the beginning. I'd be shocked if any one of you thought differently. I think the Cavs were lucky to get as far as they did, and I pretty much said as much. They got a game off the Celtics, and they certainly looked like they could put up a fight, but that, I think, says 2 things to me. One about them, one about another team I'll get to in a bit. But But we know they're in for a change, right? There's the possibility. Mitchell's been talking about a move. There's talking about some of the things that they have to do to kind of keep the roster together. I don't think they fall too far, because if you look at the East, there's a few teams that were like young and up and coming, but I don't want to. I almost said something that would have been way too sexual. They've already arrived, essentially. Like, the Magic were supposed to be a year away, and they already looked pretty good and ready to go. You look at, the teams that got hurt. So the Bucks, the 76ers, teams like that, even the Knicks, but they still did okay. If you look at the teams that are at that like kind of bottom tier that would have to replace the Cavaliers to get in, I don't think the Raptors, the Heat maybe, but I doubt it. You look at Nets aren't going to do a whole lot different. Maybe the Hornets, you could make the argument for making a run. Atlanta, Chicago. I don't know if anyone really improves so much as to replace the Cavaliers, but I don't really think there's a blueprint for the Cavs getting to the top 4 next year. And I think they will probably have to entertain that. So I don't think they fall to the bottom of the pool, but I think they definitely fall into like the play-in next year. And depending on how they handle the Mitchell situation, possibly lower if a few teams are smart and can make some moves. Prediction time for the upcoming series, and I think I'll stick with the East since I just finished with the East. Both series kind of seem like they're just going to figure themselves out, and I think there's going to be people who probably want to make the argument for some underdog wins, but I don't necessarily see it. So realistically, instead of just predicting that the Celtics are going to win in 5 or 6 or whatever people think, it's more just what has to happen for that not to happen. I think the Celtics, they do miss KP, and I think for them to really compete for the title, KP needs to come back. But it's funny, Chandler and I were watching this game, the Game 7 of Denver and Minnesota together. Now, granted, we may have had a drink or two to fog our judgment, but as soon as Minnesota won, my first reaction was, well, the Celtics just won the championship. And now I think that's a bit undermining what Minnesota can be, and I wouldn't say that's a guarantee. But the East has just not been really challenging for the Celtics, and yet they've made it look challenging, and that's going to be the biggest thing with the Celtics. Despite KP coming back for the final, realistically, they have a great defensive team when they put it together. They have a solid nucleus, and obviously Tatum and Brown as a combination. But when you watch them, there still seems to be, they're missing that kind of killer instinct. And I know that's a really vague way to put it. It's funny, the term nonchalant, I actually always recognize with wrestling, because it's the first time I ever heard it in my life was old school WWF, now WWE. When you get that like cocky wrestler who's just rolled on someone's back and wouldn't hook the leg, and then the guy kicks out, and one of the announcers is like, oh, the nonchalant cover. I still go there. I think of Ravishing Rick Rude, if you really want to know. That's the wrestler I immediately think of. But that's the Celtics to me. They're just nonchalant. They won't cover the leg. They won't hook it. They won't just take the pride and try and put it down. Give them a lead and they look horrible. They just have a stall offense where Tatum forces shots, or they just kind of dribble you into submission, and the other team comes back. Now put them in a tough match, and they've responded this year. So it's going to be interesting. They're going to have a couple rounds in a row where they're not really challenged, but they've looked like they're challenged. So if they come out and they step up and they look like the team that I think we all think they can be, this is done. But remember, Indiana got here because they shot pretty much, it was like over 70% in Game 7 against the Knicks. Now, granted, the Knicks were hurt, and they bumped into the Bucks that were hurt, so we don't really know how good the Pacers are, but we do know they have a good offense. And when they shoot like that, if you aren't on it and playing defense and closing out and making their shots really difficult and challenged, they can punch their way in. I think realistically, we also underestimate Indiana hasn't lost at home since March. I do think they do, but if they can steal one in Boston somehow, and if they can have the home court advantage and they hit every shot in the gym and the Celtics panic, that's the only way I see the Pacers actually having a fight here. I think if the Celtics keep it normal, if they win their first 2, and especially if they can at least win one fairly handily, I think that just puts too much pressure on the Pacers. Plus, it helps them because, the Celtics are that perfect team of they go from being nonchalant to panicked, and they got to find that gear in between where they're just in cruise control, but a confident cruise control. And I think with the Celtics, I haven't watched them as much as some, but it's when their defense is on. And that's why I think, as much as we talk about, Tatum and Brown, I think Holiday and White are actually probably the people that you really got to look at. And if they can really limit what Indiana can do, Siakam has shown that he can take off in a series. He can also be stopped quite easily. Halliburton, usually it's his percentages. He doesn't look as hurt as he did in the middle of the season. If he is an assist factory and he's running and gunning, that's tough. But you can get him off and you can get him a little keen to turnovers. And if that's the case, then I think the Celtics walk. So I know that's like a mushy pick. If I had to put money on it, I'd probably say Celtics in 5. But like I said, it was more building the case for what would Indy have to do to be competitive. In the West, we have the same, but different. I think Minnesota showed, that Minnesota-Denver series, like I said in my last video, that to me was the finals. I think those are the two best teams. And I think Minnesota not just has the edge in this series, but is the better team, is the best of the 4 left. However, they've also had to grind out a lot of series here, right? They had to play hard in the last one. That was definitely like their championship. So how they come off of that is going to be really interesting. And Dallas, props to Dallas. They took advantage of that 4-5 matchup. They went in and obviously they handled it in OKC. They're an interesting one because they didn't look like they had a defense until about February. And now their defense, they've got a little bit of toughness, but they still are the two-trick pony where they have a lot of people who are stepping up. But really, it's Luka and Kyrie, right? And I think if you look at that Kyrie Ant-Man matchup, I think that's super interesting. I think, Ant-Man showed he can take people out like he did with Murray. I know Murray went off in the first half, but if you look at the second half and you look at those games when he wasn't able to produce, I think that's a difference. Now, Kyrie's a little bit more polished as a player, and I don't think you're going to be able to get him off his game that much, but make him try really hard, and you don't really know. Now, it's funny, he's kind of come out this year is almost like a more standard leader. If you read much about it, Luka apparently did make a comment that his teammates, and I think part of his teammates were other people, but also Kyrie, essentially asked him, do you even like playing? You complain so much, you got to stop it. You got to act like you're more joyful and you're enjoying yourself. And I think he says he took it to heart. But it's funny when Kyrie Irving is your center point. Now, I know he's got a history where, things that make you go, sometimes come out of his mouth. But if he can be a team leader because he's been there before, he's hit the big shot, he's won a title, that would be Dallas's chance to succeed. Because I think if you just go talent by talent, I think Luka could go off, sure, but I think just that guard matchup is tough, and I don't think anyone really on Dallas can handle just the depth of size and the physicality of Minnesota. So again, I would go for that Minnesota in 5, maybe 6. So to make the argument, I think it really is, can they be a little bit more mature? Can they use that kind of, the poise? Can Luka and Kyrie combine for about 90 a game, and can they get somebody to kind of step up and be that antithesis? I just think it's going to be hard because Minnesota was definitely shown that they can already handle that in last series. So I guess the other factor is, can you grind Minnesota out? And if you make this a long series, is a couple series in a row back to back just going to be so tiring that maybe you finish them off? Again, I don't see it. I got another one in 5, maybe 6, but I don't see the upset here either. I think Minnesota goes all the way through and is still the most talented team when they get to the finals. Since last we spoke, although we do have some teams to talk about, obviously players have made a big jump. More specifically, kind of our big awards came out. At the time of recording, all that's left are all defensive and all NBA teams. So if you can see down, I've made the adjustment. Now we had Wemby win Rookie of the Year. That was pretty much, I think, the day before I posted the video, but it was the day of it was announced. I recorded. You get it. We also got Gobert as Defensive Player of the Year. I was kind of hoping Wemby just to pull one out. Didn't expect it to happen though. So congrats to Chainer. That was a steal. Remember, that was a last round pick. So well done there, buddy. We had some of the in between, like the social justice, the sportsmanship. So weirdly enough, a lot of these, the Hustle Award, like I mentioned last time, went to no one that we had. CJ McCollum, no one took. He won Citizenship Award. But Sportsmanship Award was a thing this year that we added in. And Maxey, man, so Chainer, again, great pickup. You had some, the bottom of your pool paid off, unfortunately, because your top didn't. And then obviously, that was a typo. That was not supposed to be there. I don't know why it took both. I think it just took there we go. Sorry, Tatum didn't win. I think it just copied from Player of the Month. Jokic again, so that was Horst. Horst, you finished there and you got Jokic some solid points. And Smart Money says when All NBA comes up, obviously if you got an MVP, he's probably going to get you a few more points. And it looks like he's on track for being one of probably our most high point getter, unless there's someone on both the all defensive and offensive. There's a shot I heard for my top 2 guys. I think they're going to be all NBA. I think they got a shot at defensive, but I don't think it's necessarily likely. You got Davis, could be offensive and defense. I don't think he'd be first for either. He might be first, I guess, for defense. Definitely not, but he could get a second or third team. So there's some people here that could double score. but we'll see how that kind of rolls down. I think for the most part, we see kind of here that Chainer, despite the fact that you got screwed by Embiid, congratulations, because I think you're looking pretty good. But like I said, we've still got some people to play out. I do think each of us are going to get some extra points because I think everyone's got some stuff on defensive and all NBA teams. So I'll save that kind of final wrap up for the next round because it's coming out in the next couple days. And so we should actually know well into this series and well before my wrap up what's happening there. In terms of our team points, I updated. The crazy part, 3 of the 5 of us are dunzo. So this definitely means that I think there's a reason why Rennie was fishing in that one to see about points. I'm going to throw that out actually. So just as a note, I do want a league vote, but I don't want it just to be for this year. I want it to be for all years. So in terms of a tie, I like our ideas for teams. There'll be no more shared points because I think I really didn't resonate with that. Rennie, great point. The league does decide that for us. They already have tiebreakers, so we'll go with that from now on in, whether there's a tie for first in the league or last, or conference, I should say. We'll go with that. But the player points, like I said, I was going by value, and when players have shared awards, obviously player of the month, stuff like that, I've gone for whoever they've given it to. So for league leaders, I did give it to both. However, Rennie brings up a great point that in terms of money allocation, if 2 people tie in other pools that I've run, I split it. So I'm going to offer that to League Pool. There's 5 of us. If each of us vote, we'll get to a solution. Just know that whatever we vote for this year, we do for every year that I run this thing. So that's why originally I was going to say, since Chainer and I think, shared the player that tied for the league bit, that maybe we don't get a vote. But I think it echoes into future years, so I think we should get a vote. I would just hope that we would be voting based on what we think is actually right and not just trying to get us a point for this year, because it's a 1.5, and I'd be willing to bet this thing is not going to come down to 1.5 points. But I also want to be fair, so that's what I'm going to throw out there. Anyway, long ramble. So, Chainer, you're done with 6 points, but you already kind of knew that. I think the biggest shock, Shay, I think we just assumed that you would bump through and you would get at least one of your teams to keep going. You had a chance for both in the West. It didn't really work out in your favor, so you're going to finish with 13. Horace, you're finishing with 10, which sounds bad until you say, it was really Portland that kind of dragged you down. Also, the Knicks, I really did think you were going to squeak through and get a few more points out of them. I am as shocked as anybody else that I still have a team in this fight. The Pacers were worth it anyway because of what they did in the in-season tournament. Now that I know if we look into making the conference finals, I'm guaranteed at least 6 more points. However, I don't think the Pacers are going to be in the East, so I think Rennie's going to have this locked up. I think he's going to get a 6, an 8, and a 10, which would mean he would get 18 points more than me because our 6s would cancel out, and he will definitely be taking the league or the team element of this. How that shakes out for our overall points, Rennie would be happy with that. So it's really going to come down to some player points. This one is going to get tight in that regard. So let's solve the player thing now, and then I'll update as we go. But congrats, Rennie. You dominated the teams this year. And it weren't even like, that one in the end that just kind of threw your way. These are teams, obviously, you targeted all along. So bravo, kind sir. To the rest of us, hey, folks, just cheer for me to get the Pacers. Just so we have, so the finals is going to mean something. If not, I'll still make videos and stuff, but we'll know if the Celtics go through, we will know the result of the pools going into the finals, which is fine. I'm going to do my very best in my 2 cents to not make this a rambly mess, but I want to show my math a little bit here. I want to show my work, as you would in a math class. How I got to this one was a little bit backwards, but I really started to think about how different teams in different leagues are run. And this started from a conversation I can go into more depth. Chainer has seen this because it was the end of our night, and I was proposing my theory in Toronto sports, how maybe the Blue Jays owners and a lot of baseball owners care about winning, but care about the profit first. And it becomes pretty obvious in their marketing and in the players they select. And I was playing devil advocate to see if I could frustrate somebody else. And turns out I could, if that applied to different sports in Toronto. But not getting into that fight, it does make you think about basketball, because basketball running the team is very, very different. We see this already, right? It's been a change in the past 10 years, let alone maybe 5 years, you could say. Minnesota's ownership goes to sell a couple years ago. Now, we don't necessarily know the reasons why they're stalling after so many shares were sold. But I think the owner probably realized, I think he made the deal for about $1.5 billion a couple years ago. And now he's looking at other markets going north of $4 billion. And some of the expansion teams, they say, that might be popping up going even higher. You've got a weird scene, though, in the NBA, don't you, with some of the ownership. Some are long-term owners. They've been there for years. They're never going to sell. Some are buying in as that investment. In our lifetimes, we had effectively a fan who made it rich in Cuban and then bought a team. And then how this trickles down into management, coaching, general managing, all this stuff. It's also the league where the players have the most say or seem to have the most say. Now, a lot's getting made of this right now with things like LeBron in LA. Now, we don't talk about KD as much, but I was just kind of reading. I mean, Durant, I think in the past like 10 years has had 8 coaches. And now granted, he's made a couple moves. Some coaches he's been publicly supporting or not supporting, and then a change may or may not happen. So it's not just one player. It is a player-friendly league. And if you have a superstar, sometimes they want a player coach. I actually think I don't think you can do it anymore with the collective bargaining agreement, but LeBron may as well be a player coach because he has that kind of influence. I think that's interesting the way that players do have a role, even in media, right? They jump right away. Like in other sports, you hear, I mean, obviously Kelsey has a podcast, but in Kelsey's podcast, he's not necessarily breaking down other teams and criticizing other players. He's talking about his team, his brother's team, and then dick and fart jokes, right? And so I think that is something we're comfortable with athletes. And we know eventually, like in sports like NFL, they make their way into the booth. We've seen it obviously in basketball as well. I mean, TNT is a lot of getting made, or they're losing their show, and that's because it's the Barkley Shaq show, and obviously and Kenny Smith, and the combination within. Them bringing on Draymond Green, that is a whole other rant. But I mean, you're really going to be bringing on the guy who in the past like 2 years have been suspended multiple times for legitimately one case, choking someone out, punching a teammate and trying to knock him out, punching another player during the game. And he's rewarded by getting on your show and giving commentary. I also think it's super lame. This is a tangent, but Game 5, he roasts Gobert. And if you know me, I'm not a Gobert fan, so I thought it was funny. But you're going to roast Gobert and essentially question why he's a defensive player of the league, and then you refuse to come on for Game 7 when his team wins. Just saying, you got to take the good with the bad, buddy. So they're bringing him in for analysis. Like, this is a weird league in terms of what players actually have a handle on. But to cut the tangent off and get back to my point, the LeBron thing did make me think a little bit, because if you're looking at analysis, we know the NBA draft's coming up. We know the Hawks got the first round pick, but you're also hearing a lot from all the GMs saying this is one of the worst drafts in the past 10 years. There's only one that they're highlighting in recent history, and then maybe 2 since the 2000s hits when they're saying it's that weak, and you're essentially drafting role players. And I thought about that because the Lakers do, and right now, again, commentary, you never really know. It's people just guessing. But they're suggesting that they get Bronny James just to make LeBron happy. Now, granted, if there's not a lot of talent going on and you don't think you can make a steal at that point in the draft and it's late first round, and spoiler alert, you could probably get him even later. Most teams don't want to touch him. And the ones that do, it's sadly, it's not about the kid. They're just trying to make LeBron happy. I think take away his name and you just look at the stats and what he does for a team. I mean, he's a good player. We forget that to even make D1, you got to be good. But he didn't necessarily dominate at the D1 level. In fact, he was barely a starter, and now you're going to throw him in the NBA. You also, come on, feel bad for the kid in this case. Often when kids make that huge jump, it's because they've never been given the training, the discipline, the structure to succeed. He's grown up with a dietitian and a personal trainer for him. That's not going to be the adjustment that makes him better, right? I mean, he's already kind of maxing out on potential. He's just getting older and wiser. That's another point. But it does make you think about this particular draft. And now here eventually is my come around, where I'm going to get back to teams like Pelicans, Mavericks, stuff like that. The Lakers are fine to do it because they want to make their superstar happy. So let's see what happens there. Let's see if another team tries to throw a cog in the mix. But I think it's super interesting when you look at drafts that are supposed to be good or supposed to be bad. GMs, as we know, aren't necessarily the most risk-taking because you'd rather not put your reputation on the line. We just had a recent NFL draft, right? And Caleb Williams was supposed to be the number 1, to the point that the Bears actually traded their quarterback, who was still young, to get this guy. This actually isn't about how good he ends up being, but it's because he was the consensus number 1 that if the Bears didn't take him, it's now on them. So if Caleb Williams fails, that's kind of on Caleb Williams because everyone said he was amazing. If they would have taken Drake May first and surprised the world, and Drake May fails, it's on the Bears for making a decision that's against the norm. So we've seen this play out in so many ways, and automatically in your head, you're probably thinking all the basketball examples that pop up. I just wanted to use a more recent one. But this is where the GM is really interesting. Are they making a move to be entertaining or to be successful? And are they doing it short term and long term? And I think if you're LA, you got old people, right? So making LeBron happy maybe isn't the worst decision in the world. So you can keep LeBron and Davis and maybe just get that third piece and see if you can make a run. But when you're looking at the more interesting teams, and I'm thinking of the Pelicans, I'm thinking of the younger teams, this is actually the most important draft. And I know in a draft where you know who the top 5 is, or you know there's a number 1, it lends itself to less creativity. But let's look at our most previous MVPs. When's the last MVP of the league that was supposed to be the guy coming into the league? Now, granted, that's cherry-picked because 3 of the last 4 have been Jokic, and he obviously was not someone people knew much about, but Giannis fits that bill. Embiid was supposed to be good, and he got an MVP. You can go back. Curry was passed by a lot of people. Harden, I guess, had some high. Just keep looking back. It's a fun exercise. I did it for a while. I'm not suggesting that there is a generational talent in this draft. All evidence would suggest that there's not. But what there's going to be is there's always a couple all-stars. And even more importantly, for teams like the Pelicans, sorry, not Pelicans, I've said that twice. I meant Thunder. All the times I said Pelicans in this thing, think Thunder. The role players they need are going to be there. The difference factors, the defensive stoppers, the 3-and-D guys, the wing depth guys, with the longer arms than they're supposed to have, so they can create, the unicorns that you can play around with. They're in this draft. It's just no one knows who they are. So every GM is telling you, who knows? Don't blame me. It's not my fault. But they're in there. And so here's the key. If you have a favorite team and you trust your GM, this could be one of the more important drafts we've had in a while, because the top pick isn't likely to be in the top 10, or not necessarily. So you can get a steal at 15. You can get a steal at 23, maybe. So if you trust your GMs, and like I said, the Thunder have shown nothing but solid practices in this regard. A few other teams as well. You can throw the Magic on this list. Okay, there's a list of about 5 or 6 that have made the moves to get their team close. Is there that key, or that person that is not the most important? Denver, if you were paying attention, is your answer someone who can provide something funky, a different matchup? Is this in this draft? And I think the creative GMs might see otherwise. Apologies for that little bit of a ramble. It's been a while since I went on a key on that one, but I just felt I had it in me, and I kind of wanted to get it off my chest. Plus, we have a little less basketball to talk about. So, going to cut myself off here, but obviously we're leading into our East and West Finals. Now, as I said in multiple, you know exactly when I recorded this, so probably by the time you're listening, there's been a game go by, and there's definitely been awards go by, so I'll do my best to try and keep up with the next round. As soon as the semis are done, I'll try and do another quick post video so we know going into the finals. And hopefully by then, I think all the player points will be decided, so we'll know exactly what needs to happen. We might even know our winner by then, but I'll pretend that we don't. Either way, enjoy the semifinals. We'll see you next round.